The end of the Bronze Age was not an ending, it was a demolition. Historians speak of a great collapse, a perfect storm of drought, famine, and invasion that brought the titans of the ancient world to their knees. They speak of the mysterious sea peoples, of failing crops and severed trade routes. But the stones tell a different story. The evidence left behind does not speak of conquest, of cities sacked and burned in the chaos of war. It speaks of a methodical, almost surgical, annihilation. These were not cities conquered, they were cities silenced. In the year 1207 before Christ, the three most powerful empires on earth did not fall. They committed suicide together. This is the story of the weapon that forced their hand, and the terrifying, secret pact they made to plunge the world into a dark age to save it. Our story begins not with an ending, but at the zenith of a civilization that had spanned nearly 2 millennia. The Late Bronze Age was the first truly globalized world. Egyptian pharaohs corresponded with Hittite kings as brothers. Mycenaean warlords traded their olive oil for Anatolian copper and Baltic amber. Their world was built on bronze, and the ceaseless hunger for its components, tin and copper, drove men to cleave the very bones of the earth. It was in the year 1253 before Christ, in the suffocating heat of an Egyptian turquoise mine deep within the Sinai, that they found something else. It was not metal, nor was it gemstone. Buried in a stratum of rock far older than any known civilization, the miners unearthed a cluster of large, obsidian-like objects. They were cool to the touch, impossibly smooth, and carved with geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe at the edge of one's vision. These strange stones were deemed a curiosity, perhaps a portent from the gods, and sent down the Nile to the court of the great pharaoh Ramesses II. For months they sat in the treasure vaults of Ramesses, baffling the finest priests and scholars in the kingdom. They were inert, silent, a mystery locked in crystalline darkness, until a priest, attempting a ritual of divination, struck one of the stones in a precise, rhythmic sequence. He was not chanting, he was creating a frequency. The effect was instantaneous. A low hum filled the chamber, a sound that was felt in the bones more than it was heard with the ears. The flame of every lamp trembled. The water in the ceremonial basins vibrated into 1,000 tiny ripples. The air grew thick, heavy with an unseen pressure that made the scribes clutch their heads in pain. The priest, terrified, struck the stone again, and the sound ceased. Silence rushed back into the chamber, more profound and unnerving than the hum it replaced. They had discovered a key, and it unlocked not a door, but a fundamental force of nature. Word reached the pharaoh. A demonstration was arranged. Far from the city, a single, flawless block of Aswan granite was placed in the desert sand. From a safe distance, the priest began the sequence. A series of rapid, harmonic taps. There was no explosion, no fire, only that gut-wrenching hum, rising in pitch and intensity until it reached an unbearable shriek. The 10-ton block of solid stone did not shatter. It dissolved. It collapsed into its own granular structure, becoming a cloud of dust that the wind simply carried away. The court was frozen in a state of religious terror. But Ramesses saw the truth. This was not the power of a god. It was the power of a lost science. A voice that could command the very stone of the earth. A weapon that could turn the walls of his enemies, cities, into sand. Egypt now held the key to ultimate power. A voice that could command stone and shatter armies. But to understand how this led to the pact of global self-destruction, we must first realize a terrifying truth. They were not the only ones to hear its call. 2,000 kilometers to the north, in the heart of the Hittite Empire, a sister artifact was awakening. Unearthed not by miners, but by tomb robbers plundering the grave of a forgotten king, the Hittite device was quickly seized by the priests of the storm god. At the same time, across the Aegean, Mycenaean sailors dredging a harbor near Pylos pulled a third from the mud and slime of the seafloor, where it had rested for untold centuries. The great powers of the age, rivals locked in a delicate dance of diplomacy and suspicion, had each stumbled upon the same terrible secret. A frantic, clandestine arms race began. Knowledge was shared not in letters on clay tablets, but by spies and defectors, each empire desperate to unlock the full potential of their voice of God. The experiments grew in scale and horror. The Hittites, masters of siegecraft, focused on projection. From the deck of a warship, they leveled a barren island, the resonant wave turning sheer rock cliffs into cascading gravel and boiling the sea in a perfect 100-meter circle around the impact zone. The Mycenaeans, brilliant engineers, sought precision. They tried to fashion smaller devices, sonic lances for their champions to wield. But a miscalculation in their citadel at Grilla resulted in a feedback loop that liquefied an entire wing of the Cyclopean fortress, entombing hundreds of warriors and craftsmen in stone that had flowed like water before rehardening. The initial wonder curdled into dread. This power was not stable. It was capricious. It did not just destroy its target. It warped the very fabric of the physical world in unpredictable ways. The pursuit of absolute power was becoming a terrifying obsession, a race to build a weapon that no one truly understood, let alone controlled. The tone of communication between the empires shifted. Letters that once spoke of royal marriages and trade agreements now carried veiled warnings. "May the storm god bless your lands and keep your mountains strong," wrote the Hittite king to Ramesses, a subtle threat that he could now turn those very mountains to dust. The breaking point finally came, not in a great battle for a capital city, but in a minor border skirmish near the contested lands of Amaru. It was a dispute over a watering hole, a conflict that in previous years would have been solved by a handful of chariots. But this time, both empires saw an opportunity. It was a chance to test their new weapons, to unveil their power and cow their rival into submission for a generation. Neither side knew the other possessed the same capability. As the sun reached its zenith, the sound began. Not the clamor of bronze shields or the thunder of chariot wheels, but a silent, gut-churning hum that filled the valley from two directions at once. The air itself seemed to turn to glass. Birds fell from the sky. The two resonant frequencies met. The result was not a simple negation. It was an unforeseen, catastrophic amplification, a feedback loop of pure, untethered power. In the center of the valley, the very laws of physics seemed to break. The ground did not shake, it tore. Space itself warped. The sky flickered. Soldiers from both armies, men who were prepared to die by the sword or the arrow, simply ceased to exist. Their bodies and bronze armor unraveled into shimmering atoms. The wave of annihilation expanded outwards, consuming both armies, both weapons, and 5 square miles of the surrounding landscape. A handful of scouts, miles away on high ridges, were the only survivors. They carried a message of utter horror back to their kings. They described a weapon that could not be aimed, a fire that, once lit, consumed the arsonist as readily as the victim. In Thebes and Hattusa, the revelation struck the kings like a physical blow. This was not a tool of war. It was a planetary immune response, a power that treated their cities, their armies, their very existence, as a virus to be cleansed. They had not discovered the key to victory. They had found the mechanism of their own extinction. The secret messages began to fly between the rival capitals, not of war, but of a desperate, unthinkable alternative. An alliance not of conquest, but of mutual self-destruction. But to understand the terrifying pact they made, the pact that would erase 1,000 years of progress from history, we must first look at the single, chilling message found carved into the heart of every one of these devices. A message that was not written in any human language. A message that was not written in any human language. In a desperate, unprecedented act of cooperation, the greatest scholars from every empire were brought together in secret. Their task: to decipher the alien script. They expected a curse, a warning, a final testament from the device's creators. What they found was infinitely more terrifying. It wasn't a warning at all. It was an instruction manual. The device was never a weapon. It was a geological tool, a terraforming engine, designed to resonate with planetary crusts, to build mountains, redirect rivers, and raise continents. The destructive power the Bronze Age empires had unlocked was nothing more than a catastrophic misuse of its primary function, like using a surgeon's scalpel as a sledgehammer. They hadn't learned how to build a god's weapon. They had only learned how to break it. They had found the control panel for their world, and had only managed to rig the self-destruct button. What do you do with that knowledge? How do you unlearn the secret to unmaking the world? The fear was no longer of a rival king. The enemy was now the object itself, sitting inert in their capitals. A quiet promise of total annihilation. It was a temptation that future generations, not bound by the memory of the Amuru disaster, might be unable to resist. A single ambitious king, a single moment of weakness centuries from now, could extinguish civilization forever. And so, the great kings made a pact, a conspiracy not to rule the world, but to save it. They concluded that some knowledge is too dangerous to possess. Some doors, once opened, must be sealed forever. But how do you destroy not just a physical object, but an idea? Their solution was as radical as it was desperate. They would perform a kind of intellectual suicide, an act of civilizational self-sabotage. They would not just destroy the devices. They would destroy every record, every schematic, and every person who knew how they worked. They would create a cataclysm of their own design. They began to systematically dismantle the very systems that had allowed them to create the technology in the first place. They severed trade routes to stop the flow of materials and ideas. They sowed discord among their own vassals, creating smaller, more manageable conflicts to distract from the greater truth. They began to pull their world apart, piece by piece, to bury one lethal secret. This was the Great Catastrophe, an age of fire and ruin that historians have long debated. They blame drought, famine, rebellion, and invaders. But the terrible truth is that the collapse was not a failure of the system. It was the system's final, horrifying success, a meticulously executed demolition of their own world. But there was one last act in this tragedy. The devices themselves, too powerful to destroy, too dangerous to exist. So in a final, terrifying gamble, they used the terraforming engines one last time, not as weapons, but precisely as they were designed. They didn't just bury the secret, they commanded the planet to bury itself. They created a geological prison, a tomb of folded rock and superheated magma, sealing the keys to creation miles beneath the surface, forever beyond the reach of mortal hands. And then, a great silence fell upon the earth. The world was saved, but civilization was the price. A dark age descended. 1,000-year amnesia. Humanity had peered into the fire of the gods, and, instead of seizing it, chose to put it out, even if it meant plunging themselves into the cold and the dark. Our world is built upon the ashes of theirs. Our entire history is the story they allowed to be written. We rediscovered fire, reinvented the wheel, and reached for the stars, all on the long road they forced us to take. But the earth does not forget, and some tombs were never meant to stay sealed. The end of the Bronze Age was not an ending at all. It was a terrible choice, a reset switch, pushed by kings who understood that humanity's ambition would always outpace its wisdom. It leaves us with a chilling question, one that echoes louder in our own time than ever before. If we were to discover the ultimate power, the final secret to our own world, would we have the courage to forget? History is a story, and some of its most important chapters were deliberately torn out. To help us find them, subscribe to ChronoShift.